Okay, well, let's get going. Thanks, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series of webinars looking at different aspects of communications in tough environments. I'm Nick Owens. I'm a director at Sefiani, and I head our crisis and issues management practice. Crisis management is something we do a lot of, obviously, and it's an area that I know a lot of organisations find challenging, if not intimidating. So today we're going to have a look at breaking down what makes for good crisis management and what organisations can do to both be better prepared for a crisis incident and then respond more effectively if one does hit. And all of that, of course, goes to corporate reputation management and brand resilience. I'm joined in that by two specialists who sit at different points in the crisis management spectrum. I've got Gerry McCusker, who's the founder of The Drill, an online crisis simulation and planning service. He's also the author of a book called PR Disasters, and so he's a student of bad crisis management. We've got Charlie Forsyth also, who's Chief Product Officer for Noggin Crisis, which is a cloud-based platform that helps crisis response teams sort of execute and streamline their crisis response. Charlie, Gerry, thank you both for joining us today.
Yeah, happy to be here.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Some quick housekeeping for our audience. We'll spend roughly 30-40 minutes going over some questions in discussion with our guests, and then we'll hand it over to questions from the audience. The Zoom Q&A function will be open throughout, so feel free to post questions at any stage. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can, but if we run out of time, we'll answer them offline. So let's go into it then. Perhaps, Gerry, Charlie, if you could start by describing your respective platforms and how they help organisations in crisis. Gerry.
Okay, thanks. So basically, the Drill is an interactive crisis simulation portal where your delegates will encounter a range of transmedia crisis pressures, predominantly communications, but not exclusively. And what we're looking to do is test corporate decision making in real time. And probably the unique difference for our simulator is that we think that delegates get the opportunity to feel the pressures because they really have to learn by interactive publishing. So you fully engage with the content that you experience in the site. You post social media posts, corporate statements, holding statements, letters to regulators, etc. So it's completely immersive and completely experiential.
Just learn by doing. Okay. And Charlie, the Noggin Crisis platform.
Thanks, Nick. Yes, we provide a cloud-based platform we describe as an integrated security and safety platform that has a number of different solutions in it for managing disruption smarter, which is our mission as a company. That includes business continuity management, environmental health and safety, security management, large-scale emergency management, particularly for the government sector, and crisis management for our corporate customers. So the Noggin Crisis solution that you mentioned gives businesses a kind of digital command center from which to coordinate their crisis. Can be used for things like lessons learned, after action reviews and exercises, and general preparedness, and allows you to digitize your plans, your playbooks, and your response workflows, and have a kind of general situational awareness dashboard to manage a crisis from across your business.
That's great. Should we start by having a look at the elephant in the room? And can I ask how the COVID-19 pandemic's changed crisis management and your own offerings? I mean, have you had to pivot in certain ways? Have you found some opportunities emerging, others falling away for the moment? Charlie, I know that you released a COVID pandemic module earlier this year. Has that been well received?
Yes, so we put our minds back in February to how we could help organisations with their response to COVID, initially our own customers, and then we broadened it out from there. So based on some of our own experiences as an executive team, figuring out the kind of things that we needed to do to respond to COVID and make sure our people were safe, make sure our supply chain could keep operating, etc. We have a platform that allows us to configure solutions really in a point and click environment quite quickly. So within a few days, we went from a whiteboard to a working app that we launched in the market and provided that for free to our customers and to the community as our way of kind of helping out with the platform that we had. Now that's been quite successful in terms of take up. It was challenging too to put our new product so rapidly, but then also give people a really quick way to onboard into it and get up and running fast without necessarily having to go through training or any of those kind of more traditional IT implementation processes. So that's been a real focus for us over the last few months, and then we followed that up with a healthcare variant of that module for COVID for aged care and hospitals and public health agencies as well. So look, it's changed our offering a bit. In some ways during COVID, it's a slow moving crisis as well. It's sort of, there was initial response, but then it kind of turned into business as usual. So organisations found that they needed to manage it, week by week, and it strung out over a long period of time. And then of course, the remote collaboration became a real factor as teams moved to working from home or were subject to lockdowns. Travel restrictions meant that being able to communicate and coordinate digitally was even more important than it would have been sort of being able to come together physically in a war room to manage a response.
And Gerry, that I'd imagine that the COVID-19, where people are dispersed, would be well suited to your platform.
Yeah, because we built it as an online crisis simulator. For a couple of years we've been running drills where teams in Queensland and Sydney will dial in to talk to experience the same crisis event as the head office, for example, here in Melbourne. So remote login has not been a problem for us. It's the way that we configured it. And in fact, the thing that's probably changed though is with COVID that you asked there initially, Nick, is that I think more and more organisations are beginning to understand that crises can happen to any company, any size, any industry. So I guess hopefully we think that COVID will probably increase the awareness and the value of good crisis drills and good crisis planning. But kind of at the moment we're in the middle of it, so some companies are so busy fighting the fire that they're actually not redrafting the plans for what we think is the next big event, which will be September and October. In terms of the fiscal impact,
sure,
which we're getting quite a lot of interest from too.
Yeah. And can I ask you both where your demand is coming from? I mean, what sort of companies and industries are using your platforms, and what sort of incidents and scenarios are they anticipating and planning for?
Well, we've got education. I think it would be fairly simple to state that we've done work in healthcare. It's a sector which is particularly under siege at the moment. Done work in the financial industry, again, probably with a look towards September and October. A couple of organisations wondering what the operational and reputational impacts are going to be when this so-called cliff event hits in terms of fiscal support for communities and industry. And that would categorise it probably at the moment, Nick, it would be healthcare, education and financial industry.
And what about Noggin, Charlie?
Yeah, I think, well, demand for our platform is pretty broad. We're across about 20 sort of major industries. Obviously, that changed a bit with COVID. We have a lot of transportation customers as well. So airports and airlines are obviously quite hard hit by the pandemic. We had a lot of universities, education providers as well, and they've obviously been very challenged. Those kind of organisations where there's mass gatherings of people, they've got quite a complex physical environment to manage when you think about an airport or a major university campus. But we're also quite heavily across government, emergency services in particular, utilities and retail. Some retailers, some of the bigger ones, obviously had a pretty good quarter and we're growing quite rapidly. And we've been supporting them with both emergency crisis management and physical security management as well. So the types of issues, I mean, COVID is obviously the big one, but it also, a pandemic is a unique type of crisis. There's things that come into play that none of us maybe thought too much about before that, like social physical distancing and the kind of need for the ongoing illness management of staff. So the things that people were reaching out to us for initially were things like, how do we manage the disruption to our supply chain? That was the big sort of focus initially when things hit in February, March, and the world was starting to shut down and travel was starting to shut down. How do we protect our people and keep them safe and keep in contact with them? And there's aspects of monitoring, illness management, case management of affected workers, and just generally a big focus on the health and welfare of your employees. And that played out a lot in the healthcare sector as well, who are obviously very good at looking after their patients, but had some new challenges in being able to keep close contact with all of their staff who are very busy, out there providing care, in a hospital ward. There were some new challenges with communicating to them.
Yeah, so just standing apart from the pandemic for a moment, cyber breaches obviously are topical and are increasing in prevalence and getting a lot of scrutiny right now. There are now quite clear statutory guidelines for how firms need to respond to a cyber breach. I mean, how are you seeing companies plan for and respond to breaches through your own services? Charlie.
Well, I think, everyone's probably quite aware of the surge in cyber and the general sort of lift in tempo over the last number of months, and the government's made some statements about that. I think it's lifted the issue in the minds of leaders, but it's also broadened it out a bit. So there's general aspects like having good cyber hygiene and dealing with the fact that staff are now working from home on a range of different devices, brings some new challenges to the people managing ICT. But cyber, whereas in the years have gone by, it might have just been an IT issue. You sort of have your CIO, your IT people do their things to keep the computers secure. And it was just something that happened within that part of the business. Now there's kind of a whole of organisation response and awareness around cyber. Some of the threats are human threats. They're not necessarily technical issues with fraud and phishing and other kind of challenges that businesses face, the theft of intellectual property, industrial espionage. So whereas before it was very specialised, I think now we're seeing businesses think, well, how do we actually orchestrate a response to cyber across our business? How do we be prepared in every part of our business to defend against the cyber issue, rather than just, that's just an issue for the technical guys to worry about? And that's put a lot of focus on the credentials of your software providers, cloud providers like us, making sure they have really strong security credentials, and in our case, driven a lot of interest in the sort of security credentials we provide to our government customers who store classified data with us. Businesses and corporations are looking for that level of assurance as well. And turning to those standards is a good way to get that assurance without having to become an expert in cyber yourself.
And Gerry, are you seeing companies build cyber scenarios into the drills that they undertake with you?
Yeah, it's funny. We actually ran an online simulation for a client group this week, and kind of underlying the surface level challenge that we gave them in the simulation did not look like a data or cyber issue. And I have to report, no names and no pack drills, but I think it was about 2 hours into the simulation that someone from operations identified what the nature of the actual crisis was that we were handling, and then said, this is probably a data breach, and therefore we've got kind of mandatory notification requirements here. But I think it's important to remember that, whether we're talking about COVID or cyber or bushfires, which seem like a dim and distant memory at the moment, the most important thing, and the thing that most often goes wrong, and I think this is evidenced particularly in the healthcare and aged care sector at the moment, is the quality of communication. You have to get the quality of communication. You have to get the right information to the right stakeholders at the right time in the right formats. And communication is effectively the glue that holds all of the other disciplines that respond to a crisis together. So, Nick, we can focus on cyber, we can focus on COVID, but I think that whatever discipline is involved in responding to the crisis, we have to make sure that people understand, how do we communicate well? How do we communicate at the right time and in the right formats to help the right people who are most affected by the impacts?
So what would you say your both Charlie and Gerry, your most important tips for a company to be prepared for a crisis situation and then to actually respond effectively? I mean, what principles would you be recommending they adopt?
Nick, you have to have a plan. In fact, if I can say, you have to have a drill, you have to know the drill, you have to rehearse the drill, and you have to do the drill when the crisis hits. The organisations that don't have that kind of level of, documented roles and responsibilities, processes, lines of reporting, speed of approvals, you're really struggling, because you're trying to contend with getting to grips with the crisis rather than actually implementing a plan to handle the crisis. So it's about having a plan, drilling a plan, and enacting the plan.
Yeah, I agree completely, Gerry. I also think that the ability to pivot and replan where needed is useful as well. Most crisis situations are quite unique circumstances. What our customers do when they exercise their plans is they're practicing learning how to synthesize information and how to have the right flows of information to them as a decision-making team, the right decision to support tools, so they can make really high-quality decisions in a rapid and stressful context. So absolutely have a plan and a playbook. It's fundamental. Have the considerations at hand that you might need to think through when making those decisions, but be prepared to also pivot and enact a unique response. Exercises are, for me, less of a dress rehearsal and more of a kind of a skills camp for how to think differently in a crisis situation. But I also think outside of the war room as well, it's important for organisations to build resilience and preparedness across the whole enterprise. So it's not just something that the crisis management team is good at. What we saw with COVID and what you see with a lot of these types of events is that it's a whole of organisational response. You know, that the big banks and retailers, for example, that we work with had to orchestrate changes to their businesses quite quickly in response to COVID. And so you need to have those levers to be able to pull to change your business workflows very quickly and operationalize a response outside of the PR crisis communications world, which I'm not an expert in. So I'm not just talking about managing the message and the media, but in terms of how the businesses pivots in response to that, to us is important. And I think having those things digitized so that they can be followed easily, so that everyone can see what's going on and where things are at, also really helps a lot compared to some of the more traditional.
Can I just pick up, Charlie, on that point though? I mean, I think most of the delegates who are listening to us would understand that, you know, PR and comms is not necessarily about media focus. That's where we tend to see it when it's above the line. But really effective stakeholder comms, understanding how to message, you know, good intel from operations people, good intel from HR people, from technology people. It's about maintaining the comms flow internal to the business as it encounters a crisis rather than just the external stuff. And the other thing is, I think we're both agreed, if you've got a plan, you can pivot from it and pivot back. If you don't have a plan and you're pivoting, you're basically just dancing around in a circle. You know, if you're endlessly pivoting with no anchor point, you just look like a very entertaining dancer, but you're not really getting much done, to be honest. So
yeah, that's
anchor
right.
it in a plan.
Yeah, there's a great quote I like from I think it's General MacArthur, who says plans are useless, planning is priceless. And I think that Mike Tyson also says that once said that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And I think they're saying the same thing, which is that it's great having the plan or the scenario mapped out or your playbook, but you're going to have to adapt in real time because your plan will collide with the reality of a crisis, which is unique, like you said, Charlie. So Gerry, what's the psychology behind drills as being the best preparation for a crisis that, you know, won't be exactly as you've drilled? Is it just the learning by doing that you mentioned earlier?
I think it's about, sorry, I had to reach over for a valuable cup of coffee. I think the real value of the drill is to recreate the emotional and psychological pressures that are actually going to present in a real life situation. And I think for us, I mean, we take it back, this experiential learning model that we've built with the drill is based on an old learning pyramid by a guy called Edgar Dale. And Dale was able to sort of synthesize this thought that you actually retain 90% of knowledge and learnings by actually immersing yourself in doing something. Like if you read something, you retain about 10%. If you read and see something, you retain about 25%. If you read, see and listen, you retain about 50%. So for us, the experiential learning impact trains that kind of response muscle memory. And we've had clients say to us, not only did the drill simulator give us the opportunity to put into place the principles and the plans that we thought would serve us well, but actually quite uniquely, it bonded us as a team. So we've had, as I say, we've had delegates dial in from Queensland and New South Wales and Victoria, and they're all working in discrete operational silos. That's another massive threat to crisis response, silo thinking.
Absolutely, yeah.
But when you let them actually experience the pressures and encourage them to make quality decisions in real time, and then document and publish those decisions, so that they can be held accountable for them in the post-drill review. We feel that we're actually replicating the stakes of a crisis and the stakes of decision making in a crisis. And I don't think there's anything like it. Like, I mean, you can't afford to, you can't read a manual about soccer and expect to play for Man United. But if you do all of the drills and you learn all of the moves in the system, you won't look like a complete idiot when you turn up with your kit on the day of the big game,
Yeah, and Charlie, the plans and the playbooks that are uploaded onto to a user's Noggin dashboard, I mean, they can be adapted and modified fairly easily throughout the course of a crisis, can't they? And you find that happens after a client does a drill or even in a real crisis, that the materials are updated and overhauled.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, they're kind of living, breathing things in our platform. We talk about digitizing your playbook or your plan. That can include the guidance and considerations that you might want to have in front of you as a leadership team, but it also the actions that you need to take. And you can add to them on the fly. You can create your own on the fly. They're kind of a great template, and we have a kind of a library of about 80 of these plans that we've sourced from authoritative sources around the world for all sorts of different industries. So there's kind of the sense of you're getting some good practice out of the box that you can follow, but it always needs to be tailored to each organisation, but then also to their response as well. So yes, I mean, making sure you update your plan with lessons learned after a drill or exercise is obviously critical. It's one of the points of doing that is so that you can learn as well. It's also important to make sure that we see through improvement actions that arise as well. And again, I'm thinking kind of beyond the crisis team and the war room is setting up the structures and the workflows across an enterprise to be able to respond better and make the organisation more resilient. And that can include the communications channels that you need to ensure your people are up to date, that your management team is all aware of the response, the talking points, they understand how the business wants to message the situation to all their stakeholders. And they can communicate to their customers. Effective customer communications, like you said, Gerry, it's not just about the media. In fact, the other channels and social media are just as important these days. So having the structures in place, and of course the technology to support that, so that the business can have a common picture, a common understanding, and coordinate their response and change quickly when circumstances change. That agility comes from having the tools that you need as well as the mindset.
So Gerry, just on the drill then, are you able to point to some specific examples of where companies that have done drills or role play scenarios have actually performed better in a crisis? I mean, is there tangible evidence of that?
Absolutely. The one that sticks out was an organisation which I guess you would loosely describe them as a traffic infrastructure organisation. And the amazing thing was, or the way that the client approached this, they wanted us to run a left field scenario, unbriefed to them, and their senior leaders sat with their existing crisis response plan and tried to figure out, was that plan going to allow them to respond to a contemporary crisis management set of pressures. And what they did was, Nick, they marked up the gaps in the documentation, and unfortunately, this was a document which I think was about 24 or 30 months old, and the learnings that accrued from it basically resulted in a rewrite. It would be our observation that maybe a lot of organisations have drafted a plan which lives in a folder, but it isn't actually configured to cope with the evolving media, comms, stakeholder landscape. I mean, this stuff is moving at light speed at the moment. I mean, Charlie
Absolutely,
said COVID is a relatively, I don't know if it's slow moving, it's certainly a protracted crisis. But for an organisation to sit with a plan, and they thought it was of tremendous value, to actually, don't tell us what the crisis is going to be. Let the crisis happen to us, and we will evaluate our documents and evaluate our performance against real life pressures. So for them, the learnings were tenfold. It resulted in new sections being grafted onto this plan, which was still fairly fresh. It was 2.5 years old. So an organisation getting a sense that we might have a plan, but we know we can't take any comfort in it because it doesn't actually reflect the reality of the pressures that we might face. And Nick, I think it's important to say, people say, oh, we could never have, people talk about black swan events and we could never have prepared for a crisis like that. I reckon if you've never prepared for a crisis like that, you've never been to the movies. You don't have much imagination. There is basically no kind of type of crisis that hasn't been thought about, discussed, or portrayed in some kind of media. You just really need a mischievous imagination to understand what the worst possible scenario might be, and you can prepare for it. The question, Nick and Charlie, you'll see is, are organisations willing to invest in that level of preparedness, or do they think, yeah, we'll probably manage it when it comes along. It might not affect us badly. It might not particularly bite us, but we talk about decision making. That is decision making, but I'd question if it's good decision making or whether it's actually gambling.
I think it's a really good point about investing in this, because I think some of this goes to culture. I mean, I'm often a crisis communication response is inadequate because there's an operational flaw, like a serious operational problem, and the communications. You can't put lipstick on the pig. If there's an operational problem, that's going to come out, and you're going to have to deal with that. But then even that, when you dig further, and I think the Dreamland Ardent Leisure situation is a good one. It's timely because today the Ardent Leisure, I think, is pleading guilty to a number of counts of under Queensland workplace safety and health laws. And it turns out that their response was really poor. It turns out that there's a cultural problem at that company, and I think it's funny that that some of it's about fixing that culture in the first instance, and then and that flows through to operational excellence, and then the other kind of companies that are investing in your sorts of services because they see the importance of it, because it's a decision that's come from the leadership down that yes, we need to make sure we get this stuff right. Are you seeing that the sort of companies that come to you are those forward-looking, smarter companies, basically?
Charlie?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think as probably most practitioners in the crisis space might experience, it's often when an event like that occurs that there's a bit of a, there but for the grace of God go I moment, and executives in similar industries think, gee, what if that happened to us, or how prepared are we? And that can be a bit of an incentive to have a look at your preparedness, maybe do an exercise, run a drill, refresh your plans, or get some technology into place to make sure that you can respond better. So it's definitely a catalyst for demand, because sometimes these things can suffer from being potentially a bit of a grudge purchase or a bit of a sort of hidden risk to an organisation, but super high risk when it does occur. I think with the Dreamworld situation, good organisations take safety very seriously, particularly in a what we'd call a high hazard environment. And obviously a theme park is like that, like an industrial manufacturer or an airport, for example. There's a lot of things moving around. There's a lot of hazards around the place generally. Good companies model that culture of safety from the leadership down. I've visited clients of ours where every meeting starts with a safety share. They share something that they saw that was good or bad related to safety, even the executive team. So they've kind of very much put safety at the heart of their business. And clearly that wasn't the case at Dreamworld. So look, my best response to Dreamworld is to prevent those issues in the first place. We have a large amount of our customers use our software for environmental health and safety. And through that, they have the tools to monitor what's happening with all of those assurance activities. So the routine inspections and audits, and making sure actions are followed through. Clear visibility of that, clear reporting on that, workflows to make that type of thing easy for people to follow and spot when it's not being done. That gives you your eyes on what's happening in that part of your business, and would have potentially prevented that incident from happening in the first place. But there's also safety engagement tools. We have a module like that in our platform that looks at how you drive a culture of safety, how often are you meeting about it, what's the leadership team doing, are they engaging on these topics, and kind of having your leaders model the importance of safety by prioritising those engagements and in participating in them. So more of the softer aspects of safety, but that helps to drive the kind of cultural that you need to prevent that from happening in the first place.
Nick, when you talk about investment, I kind of liken crisis management preparations to like insurance premiums.
Yes,
and,
exactly. Yeah.
And praying. You know, nobody wants to commit to insurance premiums or praying until you find yourself in the SH1T. Then you're really quite prepared to give it a go. But the one thing I would say, it's really interesting thing about action and perception. And we did some analysis through a media partner on the Dreamworld response. And if I asked people to say how well did the Dreamworld, you know, or how rapidly did the Dreamworld publish in response to this crisis, most people would say, oh, it took them days and it was all over the place. The analysis showed that Dreamworld had a statement out about the incident, acknowledging the incident, acknowledging it was due for investigation within about 2.5 hours. Now, I just say that not to defend the organisation, but to talk about the reality of what organisations do to respond to a crisis and the evolving crisis narrative and the way that it's framed and the way the long-standing sting of that framing can affect a brand are two quite different things. I mean, an organisation getting a response out just over 2 hours, it's not brilliant, but it's really not awful given contemporary practice and processes and protocols. But the perception is they didn't communicate in any way correctly. Now, there were numerous missteps operationally, communications and reputationally, but I just think it's important to look at the data and say, well, actually they did respond, but they probably didn't respond well enough, emotionally intelligently enough, and consistently, and all of these other factors. But it's important to understand what is done and then what is perceived to have been done and what is framed by the media and what is framed by search engines.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, you know, I mean, they may have got a statement out quickly, but they weren't able to control the narrative subsequently. So I think there's something went wrong with media management there, and there was some bad optics in the way that they say it. So their people went out. But you're right. Yes, it is important to have to actually analyse actually what happened. But then what we live with is the perception of how it was handled subsequently. So just a couple of quick questions of each of you. Charlie, just obviously, you know, an organisation's crisis teams these days are very mobile. They're you know, and increasingly now during the COVID time, they're working from home and quite widely dispersed. So mobile functionality, I would expect, is something that all platforms like yours really have to invest in and get right and improve. Similarly, I mean, a lot of companies have their own social media listening and real-time media monitoring applications and stakeholder databases, all of which has to be within quite close reach in the midst of a crisis. Are you able to build those into your platform? Have you had to evolve your offering to accommodate a lot of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably goes without saying that the mobile is the most ubiquitous device people are accessing things on, and COVID's probably increased that. It's always the thing that we have in our hands or in our pockets. And so when we built the platform we have is a rebuild after about being in the market for about 10 years, and we took what we call a mobile first approach to the design, thinking ahead that people will be doing things from all sorts of different places. So again, taking people out of the traditional war room and making the most of that tool that everyone has in their hands. Obviously, people need to access information wherever they are in the world, and that becomes a channel then that you can use to keep in touch with your employees. And we saw that during COVID, where people were using mobile apps and SMS to reach out to workers before they even arrived at work. How are you feeling today? Are you feeling unwell? Have you checked on your health recently, as a way of monitoring the health and welfare of their workforce. Social media tools as well. Yes, I mean, we have a kind of a dashboard system that allows you to, within seconds, kind of bolt in sources from all over the place, whether it's social media, open source news, other information systems that you have in your business, so that you can really just have, you know, at a single click or tap away all the information that you need to monitor the situation, including what's happening on social media, looking at things like sentiment and trend. You know, how large is the conversation there? How is it trending? They're all good indicators of what's going on with the conversation around the brand and what their response is. And that's obviously really important.
Mm. And Gerry, virtual teams, workplaces look like they're going to be the way of the world for a while yet. So I think it seems that your product is, in the one of the moments, so to speak.
Look, Nick, you can call me a visionary if you want. It's okay. I don't have a problem.
I'll call you a visionary. That's fine. But are you saying that
I was just going to say, actually, the idea of the war room. The war room is basically a concept to say that all of the key decision makers and topic owners understand that they have a responsibility to scramble and to commit the time and to research the plans and follow the documentation to enable us to respond effectively to any issue or crisis. The idea of doing it virtually makes perfect sense, and in some ways I think it can actually de-escalate some of the more interpersonal conflicts that might occur when somebody's in the same room. I mean, I've seen the debates, for example, between maybe communicators and legal people, or CEOs and operational people about transparency, disclosure. I actually think this is perhaps, I might volunteer, a more civilized format, because I actually can't, I'm not close to you, Nick. I'm not close to you, Charlie. I can't judge you too harshly in that interpersonal sense. So I think it's a fantastic opportunity to activate war rooms easier than we ever could before, because it used to be about war rooms around diaries and executives, big decision makers in different cities. We can all log into a virtual war room, but follow the plan and make the high quality decisions that are required to help the stakeholders most affected by the crisis. This is a phenomenal time in communications and collaboration technology. In some regards, we're so lucky to have this stuff available to us. We should be handling and responding to crises better than ever before, because of technologies like Noggin, because of technologies like the drill, and the many more that are available for organizations to deploy. But will people invest in them? Will they commit to making the use of technologies a critical part of crisis response?
Yeah, just there's a couple of questions coming through from the audience, but I just want to round off on one final point that goes to aged care. Aged care is quite topical. There's some pretty serious issues in Victoria. There are a couple of examples here in New South Wales early on in COVID that I think are instructive, because they're just quite contrasting experiences, and I think they go to what you said before, Gerry, about stakeholder management. And I mean, I have a strong belief that crisis preparedness or crisis readiness is much more than just a couple of media holding statements and some Q&As. It's got to be a 360 degrees, all of stakeholder exercise. In the first case, Dorothy Henderson Lodge was probably the first COVID cluster in Australia. Was North Ryde, an aged care facility, but it seemed to be quite well handled. There was no sort of no angry families. There were some deaths, tragically, obviously, but the media statements were sort of were open and seemed to strike the right tone and were timely, and they actually earned praise from the Premier through their handling of the whole exercise. Fast forward a month or 6 weeks, and there was another aged care facility, Newmarch House, where again residents were dying, but quite differently. Family members were upset because they weren't being told what was going on. Staff were confused; they weren't able to say what was happening. So family members started going to media, of course, and so that's where the problems arose. And it turns out that their engagement with regulators was a little bit patchy, and they were rebuked by the Premier at a media conference, in contrast to the other example. I think that goes to bad stakeholder management. So that if you're not communicating with your staff or with your customers or clients, in this case, or family members, then they will eventually go to media, and that's where the problems will snowball. So I think you have to get all of those stakeholders right in order to handle the situation well. How do you think your platforms would have helped Newmarch House? Do you think? I'm actually surprised that a large aged care operator like that hadn't modelled an infectious disease outbreak in one of the facilities, especially during COVID-19, because it seemed pretty obvious. But how do you think your platforms would have helped them respond in that case?
For us, I mean, I can't talk about the quality of the communications themselves, but the ability to have consistent messaging, a way to get that out to your teams via a range of different channels, proactively check on the welfare of your people to actually contain the spread of infection or prevent it from breaking out in the first place. The kind of proactive health updates that we provide in our healthcare pandemic response module, the two-way messaging to keep in touch with people wherever they are, and of course, you know, the ability to digitise those plans and playbooks. That's assuming they had a good plan in the first place. I'm not sure if they did or not. And I think you're absolutely right about the way that the stakeholders were managed. There's a stark contrast there.
Yeah.
I suppose for us, you know, it's heart saddening to see a sector which already went through the ringer with the Royal Commission into aged care. It almost beggars belief that that wasn't a big enough wake-up call for an entire sector to embrace the tools and technologies to allow them to better respond to these things. And I think for us at the drill, one of the things that the platform allows us to do is to as I've explained before, is very tangibly flush out shortcomings. As I say, if we run a crisis simulation with a kind of rather large financial brand, and it takes them 2 hours to identify the nature of the threat that they're facing, that probably is going to set off alarm bells. So for us, we would be, when we create a realistic simulation with realistic media assets and regulator emails and all of these kind of pressures that are saying, these are the stakeholders who want a bar of you and a share of you when a crisis breaks. You've got to be flushing out shortcomings like your approvals process, your communications capability, your appetite for engagement, your ability to optimize and disseminate messages, your prioritization of affected stakeholders, your requirements to the regulators and the governance bodies who apply. All of that gets flushed out when you do this thing in real time. And that's got to be the greatest value, because unless you test your system, as Charlie says, unless you test your plan, you don't know what you're missing. You don't know where your vulnerabilities are.
Yeah, that's right. I've worked on a number of drills where over the course of the drill, a number of shortcomings have been discovered and identified. And I actually think that's a good outcome for the client, because when you and in some cases we've gone back and done the same drill a year later or 2 years later, and the improvement is often quite significant. So, no, it's better to make mistakes in the drill than in the real situation.
We say that we try to give clients the worst day of their professional life, but it is a day where nobody loses their job. It is a day where everybody gets to go home and have dinner and play with the kids and watch your favourite show. But the value of these technologies is that they allow us to prepare properly, so that you don't have to scramble to do it in real life, where the consequences for yourself, but for your affected stakeholders, are much more deadly.
Okay, well, that's been very instructive, gentlemen. There's a couple of questions that have come through. The first one I might just deal with is more just a sort of a point of clarification. Someone's asking whether Noggin and the drill are competing services or they're slightly different, and I think the short answer is that the drill is a simulation tool, as I know it, Gerry. So it's really for crisis readiness. Noggin is really a response platform for incidents that occur that streamlines a crisis team's response. Is that correct?
I would think that they're probably spiritually in the same place, but they do really sort of fulfill different tasks, but they're probably quite complementary, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think there are different points in the crisis management services spectrum. Just one question here about the cancel culture, which I think is quite relevant actually. There's been a bit of an uptick in it recently. Do you think that's something that brands will have to factor into their crisis communications? I mean, I think certainly from a crisis communication standpoint, yes, they do. Some of that goes to values, of course, and how the company behaves and acts. But it is worth planning for a movement that arises from an activist group targeting a particular brand for something they've done, where they've advertised or whatever on Alan Jones, for example. We saw a lot of that. Have you a perspective on that?
Yeah, I think the reality of today's media landscape, and the media landscape has become kind of everybody's landscape. Everybody can, you can fill your boots, you can participate. It's a game for all the family. So I do think that cancel culture can bring a set of pressures and scrutiny to bear on brands that might not have been able to be surfaced and mobilised so readily even 3 years ago. As to how an organisation decides to assess, triage and respond to cancel culture pressures, it really depends on the appetite, the brand values, the flexibility, but also the organisation's goals. Now, if I said that every brand had to respond to every accusation brought on by a cancel culture element, I think I would be scaremongering in the extreme. But as we say, if you've got a plan, if you know how to assess threats, understand the stakeholder impacts, that will allow you to better decide how do we, again, Charlie said it, I'll say it again, how do we make high quality decisions at the issues management stage so that we don't have to make high quality decisions at the crisis management stage? I know which I'd prefer to do, and I know what I prefer to counsel brands to do. Issues management is generally simpler or has less consequential pressure than crisis management. You're much near the sharp end of the pain.
Charlie, are clients using Noggin for activist groups targeting their brands?
Well, I think it's one of the reputational risks or threats that our customers are aware of, and we actually do work in intelligence in government as well, where those kind of groups, where more nefarious groups are kind of tracked and managed as well. So yeah, so I think so. I mean, it's part of what we describe as situational awareness, as something that you need to keep a watching brief on. Being aware of what's going on around your organisation and its brand is key to that. It's also about the ability to monitor that situation when things go wrong, and kind of reach out across the organisation with that response.
Yes, and I imagine social media listing becomes important in that situation. Gerry, do you have a view on cancel culture?
Well, I think I've just said, I think we really got to kind of evaluate properly, but I don't think it's cancel culture as a phenomenon has appeared. Let's respond to absolutely every allegation. I think we've got to be very discerning and understand the risks and the import and the impact. Yeah,
thanks. So there's a comment here on the chat forum. And it goes to what you were saying before about the investment that your users and your clients are making, or that some companies are making in crisis readiness and response. And I can imagine many CEOs and boards will be wondering how much they will need to invest and what they'll get. Gerry, can you comment on that?
I think it came from Alec, and I know Alec professionally. We're also both got these cute accents that we've got. How much you have to spend on this? I don't think it's as linear as saying if I spend 20 grand, I'll get 20 grand's worth of coverage. I think it really comes out of an effective issues audit. Now, many of the people who are dialing in will be issues management, crisis management specialists. How much you're going to have to commit depends on how exposed you are to threats and vulnerabilities. And I think that absolutely, rather than saying, I'm going to put down 30,000 and do a proper crisis simulation, or I'm going to invest in Noggin for a period of 6 months and then I'll be bulletproof forever. I don't think it works like that. Issues and threats are always evolving. Unless you understand that issues landscape, you can't really know how much you're going to commit. But I can say, if you commit nothing to crisis preparation and zero to crisis technologies, the cost to you in the long run is likely to be much, much greater than if you had done so, committed resources earlier.
There's a question here for me, actually. So when a client comes to you with an emerging issue, how do you decide when to go public with the client's position? Well, I have to say, it really depends. It's a case-by-case situation. It really depends on the circumstances, and it's one of those very fine judgment calls that come with crisis communications and issues management. In this case, because if you know the issues coming up, it's really more what we call issues management rather than a crisis, which is unexpected. Some of it goes to organisational transparency. If there's an issue of public safety or employee safety, then they need to be advised straight away, or fairly promptly. That goes to their responsibility. But I don't think the media necessarily need to be told everything straight away at the earliest opportunity. I think there's a point as the issue unfolds, that a client may need to advise employees about what's happening, or their customers or regulators. And I think those communications, you should assume that they may get leaked, and so you need to be ready then to respond to media interest. There are but having said that, there are other situations where you might actually want to get in front of the issue and advise media in advance, so that you're seen to be proactive in dealing with it. So it really is a fine judgment call, and it's one that you have to assess in the circumstances of the moment.
I would have to say, though, generally as a principle, Nick, I don't know if you share my kind of ethos. We usually think that a good or workable statement early in a crisis is much better, given the dynamics of the reputational landscape, is much better than a perfect statement late in the crisis. I would just say, I noticed today that here in Melbourne, one healthcare provider, very much under the media pump, somebody spoke on their behalf and said, almost spoke 2 or 3 days too late, but said, the staff are doing a fantastic job. The narrative that is being portrayed is not accurate. There are many great things going on here. But I just question the value of that kind of statement after the media and social media has run riot for 2.5, 3 days, and perhaps even longer. So for us, I think philosophically, good quality information published early with the option to update is better than perfect statement late in the game.
Absolutely, yeah. Charlie, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think in terms of how plans are changing, to me, the plan isn't something that's rigid, but it's kind of a way to learn how to assess impact across the organisation. So, learning how to think ahead and use your imagination to assess that impact is kind of a key skill to develop through the planning and the exercising process.
There's another question here about Ardent Leisure, which we spoke about before, in the Dreamworld situation, that they have pleaded guilty to some charges, and the point's made that it was one of the sort of worst managed crises in recent times. If Dreamworld had been your clients respectively, how might have you advised them or assisted them through that situation?
I don't know. I feel it's a very difficult one to sit at this juncture. I mean, to be honest, I really feel for good practitioners working within a system that doesn't resource them or enable them to effect the quality of work that they perhaps want to do. I mean, there are ultimately personal decisions, but one of the things that I observe in many corporations, many government departments, is that there are restrictions brought in by systems, processes, culture, appetite, which restrict practitioners from making good quality decisions, or the decisions they know they would like to effect. And so today, I think it's pretty raw again for all at Ardent Leisure, and I probably don't want to. I don't want to jump up and down and be too vocal in my criticism about it. I think it's been long standing. I think there's been a lot of lessons learned, and I prefer to leave it at that.
Sure. Just a question here from Shannon, saying that the world's changing. Plans could be hard to make for the situations we're finding ourselves in. Well, that is true. I mean, our external environments are changing all day by day. How do you advise companies to create their crisis plans during this time? I guess that sort of goes to what we've been speaking about over the past hour.
Well, Shannon, the other thing that we've got within the drill, which we think is really useful, we've actually got what we call a 4M methodology, which covers kind of 4 key areas that we think organisations need to adhere to when they respond to a crisis. That's in turn built on another kind of best practice crisis management model from the further education sector. And so we've got this kind of like 4M framework. And now nearly every good technology that helps you prepare for crisis has got a kind of templated framework that allow you to process your thoughts and document your best guess responses. And I think having that kind of working process, as Charlie says, it will never be hard and fast for every situation, but understanding the ground that you have to cover and the mandatories that you have to respond to in every crisis is really well supported if you have a model that you're working with. And we built one into the drill, which we think works pretty well. It's pretty memorable, and it really helps clients do exactly what you're asking, I think.
Yeah, well, as a technology person, you know, I say digitally is important. You know, make them something that's actually living and easy to enact, and then track the progress of, or tweak and tailor as you go forward, rather than the document that sits in a drawer that then can be quite difficult to engage with when you need to use it. So make it something that's easily actionable and changeable and editable as you go. There's also a lot of great practice and guidance out there. You can start with that, like the kind of templates that you referenced, rather than having to create everything from scratch. I'm not an expert in crisis planning per se, but one of the themes, and I mentioned it before, for us is learning, you know, having the right considerations in front of you to be able to think strategically and creatively about that unique situation that you find yourself in, being able to model the impact across your business and think ahead of that. Yeah. So good plans help you do that and give you the options that you need to think about to then come up with what may be quite a unique response. And yeah, like we've been talking about, it's just as much about exercising those muscles and getting good at responding, rather than a plan that you just wrote follow, and if you follow steps 1 to 53, then you know everything will be good.
Absolutely.
Nick, can I just pick up something quickly on Charlie? And I know we're at time. We did some work recently, and we asked the organisation to talk about the inhibiting factors that they thought would slow down or compromise their responsibility, their ability to respond to affected stakeholders. And when the client unpacked the issues, they were all almost entirely selfish issues. And when I say selfish issues, I mean issues that this will affect us as a business in this way if we try to help those people most affected that way. And it was a phenomenal moment of truth for the organisation, because I said, of the reasons that you're saying you would not respond in the most timely or effective way are because of selfish considerations. And we all know that the best way to respond to a crisis is to think about the stakeholders most affected by the pain points of the crisis and figure out how do we respond so that we can ameliorate and negate that pain. Instead, you get organisations thinking about how do we protect ourselves, how do we minimise the exposure to us, how do our execs stay safe? And you cannot effectively do this in this modern porous media age by being selfish. You have to be generous and think of where the pain point is hitting most hard.
Yeah, that's actually well said, and a lot of that goes to the corporate values, as we said. Just one final quick question here, and I apologise if I didn't clarify that earlier. Does Sefiani work with the drill and Noggin? Yes, we are actually a partner of Noggin. We've had a partnership agreement in place with Noggin, and the drill we've started working with as well. So yes, the short answer is we are well done to both of these firms. I think that's all we have time for today, Charlie and Gerry. Look, thanks very much for joining us. It's been really good to have you, and I've really enjoyed your insights, and I hope our audience has too. Thank you to our audience, and I do hope that they found the discussion useful. If you've got any questions about anything that was discussed today, or would like to discuss your own crisis readiness, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you possibly at our next webinar. Thank you very much.
Many thanks.
Thanks, Charlie and Gerry.
You're welcome.